Under surveillance this morning, pricing a Warsh-led Fed.
His history is that of being somewhat hawkish, both in terms of inflation vigilance and interest rates. And he continues to talk about reducing the balance sheet and reducing the footprint of the Fed in markets. At the same time, he's been aligned with President Trump in the White House in recent remarks. So it's not clear to me which Kevin Warsh will show up in May.
So here's the latest this morning. The future of the Federal Reserve in focus as investors anticipate policy changes once former Fed Governor Kevin Warsh returns to the central bank. Joining us now to discuss is Marc, the former Chief of Staff to former Vice President Mike Pence. Mike, welcome back to the program. Let's go through some of the details and some of the endorsements we've had over the past few days. Geeta Gopinath, Mohamed Al-Erian, the Prime Minister of Canada, Mark Carney, and the list goes on and on and on. Is Kevin Warsh a pretty conventional Republican pick to lead the Federal Reserve?
Look, I think he is. He's somebody who's been on the Reserve before, and I think that of the options, it's a pretty strong pick for the president. I know there's some people who question, what these hearings are going to be like when he gets there because of positions he took against quantitative easing after the financial crisis and reconciling that with a very dovish approach now. But look, if the Senate can confirm Tulsi Gabbard to DNI and Kristi Noem to DHS, I don't think it's going to be much of a challenge for them to confirm Kevin Warsh here to the Fed.
Mark, you were in the room in Trump 1 when the debate was going on who Trump was going to pick, and he ultimately landed on Mnuchin's pick of Jay Powell, which I know was not VP Mike Pence's choice. What do you think went behind this process, why Kevin Warsh was picked and not the other Kevin?
Well, look, I think there were basically three finalists in the last go round. There was Jay Powell, there was Kevin Warsh, and there's John Taylor. And I think that there were different camps aligned with each. But the reality is that Steve Mnuchin made the appeal to the president. Then when the president asked, he said, who's going to keep rates lower? And Mnuchin was clear in saying it would be Jay Powell. And I think that's what the president was looking for. It was less of a question about sound monetary policy. It was a question of who's going to push for lower rates. And, there's an irony, of course, now that the president is upset with Jay Powell for not having rates lower. But I have to believe that there's been, that same conversation has repeated itself this go round. And I think there's probably been assurances that Warsh is going to adopt a dovish approach here.
But that's why it's so precarious, given the fact that when he was at the Fed, he actually was calling for a hawkish, tighter monetary policy. Do you think his views have truly evolved, or is he just trying to be politically correct in the moment to get a job?
I don't know that I can put myself in his shoes and know that. I think that I do think he has certainly the credentials here. Again, as I said, of the options, I think there's probably a lot of comfort on the street and comfort in the Senate that this is where the president landed. And he is going to have to address the apparent change in position from where he was after the financial crisis to where he is today. But nonetheless, I think that he's going to have a term that's going to extend far beyond President Trump's term, and so he perhaps is playing a long game here too.
Mark, I'd love your take on what we heard from Tom Tillis, the North Carolina senator who seems to not care at all since he's not running for re-election and is going to block the process until the DOJ lawsuit or complaint against the Fed is lifted. Do you think that he has more popular support among sitting Republicans than he did maybe a couple weeks ago, not just with this, but in general?
He probably does. I think there are others who are applauding some of the positions he's taking, but feel they can't take the same because they'd be concerned about their own reelection options. But, I think that as it comes to, he's going to block this until the investigation is concluded on Jerome Powell. I think most people assume the investigation of Jerome Powell is less on the merits and more an effort to pressure the Fed to lower rates. And so at the end of the day, is the White House going to say, we're going to continue the investigation, or we're going to say, hey, we've got our own guy now to run the Fed, so let's pull back on the investigation. It seems like at the end of the day, it seems to me that this is not something that's going to continue into next year, as potentially the president suggested, on Air Force One the other night. It seems to me there'll definitely be a desire to pull back on the investigation to allow this to move forward.
I guess I was getting at something bigger, especially because we are in midterm year where we're going to be getting a government shutdown evidently every 2 weeks. And I'm just wondering, Mark, going forward, at what point you start to see Republicans look at either distancing themselves from President Trump's policies? Are you seeing any groundswell of that, especially after the special election in Texas, after the midterm outcomes? Are you seeing anything like that, or is it sort of a case-by-case situation?
I think it's more case by case, but I think it's going to continue to ramp up, I would say, over the course of the year. And it's not just Texas. I mean, there's been a series of special elections in deep red states of Mississippi and Georgia in which Republicans have been defeated. And so there's clearly a trend building at this point. And there's no doubt that other Senate Republicans are recognizing that. However, they also know that the president has enormous sway over the base, and particularly in primaries. And so I would look to see more Republican senators distance themselves after you get through primary season, but being reluctant to do so until they've secured their nomination, and then that's behind them. So yeah, Tillis is in a different position. I don't anticipate you're going to see too much more of that in the short term, but perhaps toward the summer months, I think as members look toward the general election in November and they're behind their primaries, that's when you'll begin to see more members begin to perhaps take positions similar to Tillis.
Mark, on a final note on Kevin Warsh, the president spoke at a dinner over the weekend. I'm reading a quote Washington Post had. Someone in the room actually said to me, all of this is accurate. Quote, if he doesn't lower interest rates, I'm suing his ass off. And then the president says, I'm kidding. Mark, do you think he's actually kidding, or is Kevin Warsh potentially going to face the same fate as Jay Powell if he doesn't lower interest rates?
Well, I think he would face the same fate if he didn't lower interest rates. But again, I think this process has played out for a while. It's pretty hard for me to see that the president would not have moved forward with this nomination unless he had pretty strong assurances that Warsh was looking to lower rates when he got there. And so yeah, I think he would, if he didn't, I think he would face the same pressure from the president. I think the president's somebody who likes lower rates for lots of reasons. He made his resources in real estate. The president believes that it's better for exporting and for manufacturing base if the dollar is depreciated. And I think he knows the impact on equity markets when rates are lower. And so I think he wants to continue to push for that agenda regardless of who the personnel are inside the Fed.
Hey, Mark, thanks for making time for us. Marc Short there, the former chief of staff to the former Vice President Mike Pence.